A world that demands louder voices, quicker replies, and constant validation. The one who pauses, listens, and chooses silence holds the real power. Most people speak because they feel they must. To fill the awkwardness, to prove they were right, to avoid being misunderstood. But silence, intentional silence, is a different kind of power. It doesn't come from fear. It doesn't come from pride. It comes from clarity. When you choose to be silent, not to punish, but to preserve your peace, you shift the dynamic. You are no longer reacting from the outside in. You're responding from the inside out. And that shift, that energy, is deeply felt. There is something sacred in a woman who knows when to speak and when to let silence be her answer. Because in that moment, she is not seeking to win an argument. She is mastering her response. And men, real men, can't help but notice. This kind of silence is not passive. It is protective. It is transformative. It is a signal that you have graduated from needing to be heard to choosing to be understood without words. And that's where respect begins. Welcome to Self-Mastery, your space for real wisdom and inner growth. Subscribe and remember name of our YouTube channel, Self-Mastery, because others may copy the voice, but the truth lives here. Let us begin. There's a silence that speaks louder than any shout, any explanation, any justification. And when it is embodied with awareness and inner certainty, it creates a kind of gravity that pulls respect toward it. Not by force, not by demand, but by resonance. This silence isn't the silence of disconnection. It's not passive aggression, nor is it the silence of defeat. It is presence without interruption. It is the quiet strength of a woman who doesn't rush to fill the air with words just to be heard. Instead, she understands something far deeper, that when she enters the room, her energy arrives before her voice does. There is something compelling about a person who doesn't scramble to explain themselves, especially in moments of conflict or emotional challenge. It tells the world, I don't need to convince you. I am already clear within myself. And that clarity carries more power than any rehearsed speech. Imagine a moment that many have experienced. You're in a relationship where the conversations have become cycles, endless loops of justification, emotional appeals, and repeated explanations. You try to express your feelings clearly. You try to be understood, but somehow, no matter how much you say, it doesn't land. The more you explain, the more it feels like you're pouring water into a broken cup. And then one day you stop. Not from exhaustion, not from bitterness, but from realization. You don't raise your voice. You don't chase closure. You simply allow space. That moment of silence, it is different. It's not a reaction, it's a conscious response. And in that stillness, something shifts, not just in the other person, but within you. Science has already begun to support what ancient wisdom has always known. The human brain reacts to silence in profound ways. In the presence of stillness, the default mode network of the brain becomes more active. This is the part of the mind associated with self, reflection, and emotional integration. When you fall silent, especially in emotionally charged situations, it gives others a mirror. And mirrors have the strange power to reveal what words cannot. In one study conducted by neuroscientists, it was found that even brief moments of silence, just 2 minutes, were more calming to the brain than soothing music. Imagine then the power of a woman who doesn't just fall silent temporarily, but embodies silence as a way of being. Not cold, not removed, but fully centered. Her silence doesn't create distance. It invites others into deeper presence. People aren't used to this. Most people operate from reaction. Someone speaks and we respond. Someone disrespects us and we defend ourselves. But when you don't rise to that level of chaos, when you remain anchored, it disrupts the pattern. Consider a real-life moment shared by a woman in her late 40s. After 20 years in a marriage where her feelings were routinely minimized, she stopped trying to explain them, not out of resignation, but out of self-respect. Her husband, used to long arguments and emotional persuasion, was disoriented by the sudden quiet. He asked, "Why aren't you saying anything?" She responded simply, "Because I don't need to." That single sentence, grounded in peace rather than defiance, created a ripple effect. Over time, he began to sit with his own behavior rather than deflecting. He began to listen. Not because she raised her voice, but because she had lowered her need to be heard. There's a saying, the quieter you become, the more you can hear. But the reverse is also true. The quieter you become, the more others start to listen. And what they hear isn't always comfortable. Because in your silence, their own conscience becomes louder. And yet, this is not a strategy to manipulate others. True silence, powerful silence, doesn't come from tactics. It comes from self-mastery, from the discipline of not leaking energy in every direction, from knowing that your voice matters, but it doesn't always need to be used to prove a point. Stillness is not just a state, it is a skill. And like any skill, it grows through practice. Begin with the small moments, a disagreement where you'd normally defend yourself, a text that provokes you, a memory that tries to pull you back into proving your worth. Resist the urge to react. Instead, pause. Breathe, observe. Let silence speak for you. Let it carry the weight of your peace. Because sometimes, when a woman chooses to say nothing, it is the loudest declaration she will ever make. There is a beautiful discipline in this kind of silence. It is not emotional suppression, it is emotional refinement. And that leads us into a deeper truth. Emotional regulation is more powerful than emotional expression. The modern world often tells us to express everything. Speak your truth, it says. Don't bottle things up. And there is truth in that. When your heart is silenced for too long, it begins to decay from within. But there's another layer of wisdom. Not everything that is true needs to be said in the moment it is felt. There's a timing to truth, a season for every word. And often, the strongest people are not those who speak first, but those who know when to wait. Emotional regulation is not about ignoring your feelings. It is about having the patience to let your emotions mature before releasing them. Just as fruit picked too early is sour and hard, words spoken too soon often lack the ripeness of understanding. In psychology, this is known as response inhibition, the ability to pause between impulse and action. It is directly tied to emotional intelligence and is a predictor of relationship satisfaction. People who regulate their emotional impulses, who don't lash out when triggered, build trust. Why? Because they are seen as emotionally safe, consistent, grounded. Let's consider a familiar situation. A woman receives a message from her partner that feels dismissive. Her chest tightens. Her mind starts racing. The urge to fire back, to demand clarity, rises like a wave. But instead she pauses. She closes her eyes. She asks herself, is this reaction about this moment, or is it touching something older in me? That pause, it changes everything. Because in that space between the trigger and her response, she reclaims her power. She is no longer being puppeted by her emotions. She is choosing how to respond from a place of wholeness, not reactivity. And this choice not to erupt, not to beg, not to chase, is the very thing that elevates her in the eyes of her partner. Men especially respond to this kind of emotional consistency, not because they want women to be quiet or detached, but because they instinctively trust what is stable. Emotional regulation signals maturity. It shows that a woman has not made her peace dependent on how someone else behaves. And that, again, is rare. There's a story of a woman whose partner forgot their anniversary. In the past, she would have exploded, feeling unseen, unvalued. But this time, she said nothing. She simply went about her evening with calmness. When her partner realized the oversight hours later, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of meaning, full of presence. And in that space, he felt something he hadn't before, not guilt, but deep respect. Because she hadn't screamed, she hadn't demanded, she had offered him the dignity of reflection. That's what emotional regulation does. It gives others the opportunity to grow, because it removes the noise. And in that quiet, people face themselves, not because you forced them to, but because your restraint invited something higher from them. Eastern traditions speak of water as the most powerful element. It yields, but it wears down mountains. It flows, but it shapes the earth. Emotional regulation is like water. It doesn't fight what it encounters. It adapts, but over time, it transforms everything it touches. To practice this is not to be less emotional. It is to become more refined in how emotion is channeled. Anger can become clarity. Sadness can become depth. Disappointment can become discernment. But only if we allow silence to do its work. The silence that follows emotional regulation is not cold. It is not distant. It is sacred. It says, I am strong enough to feel this and wise enough not to be consumed by it. That is the kind of presence that shifts relationships, not through force, but through example. And the truth is, this the person who masters their emotions is the one who becomes the anchor in every storm. Others feel safer around them, even if they don't know why. Respect follows them, not because they demanded it, but because their energy commands it. So when a woman chooses stillness over reaction, when she lets her silence speak instead of her triggers, she isn't withholding. She is leading, not just in her relationship, but in her own evolution. And from that inner evolution, a new kind of partnership becomes possible. One built not on noise, but on depth, not on fear, but on frequency. There are moments in life when words can no longer carry the truth we feel. When a person has crossed a line, not by accident, but by intention, something within us begins to shift. And in that shift, we are faced with a choice. Do we explain, defend, and argue for the respect we deserve? Or do we fall silent, not in surrender, but in self-honor? Respect begins where words end. It begins at the threshold of your own energy, where you realize that not every act of injustice deserves your emotional engagement. There is a kind of silence that doesn't retreat, but rises. It's not the silence of fear, nor of avoidance, but of clarity. A woman who knows she deserves to be treated with care no longer tries to convince anyone of her worth. She simply reflects it. And when her silence follows mistreatment, it is not a tactic. It is a testament. To stay silent in the face of manipulation, condescension, or betrayal is not to suppress the truth, but to embody it without resistance. Because when words fall into deaf ears, silence becomes the echo that cannot be ignored. In relationships, especially those strained by recurring patterns of disrespect, the most powerful shift happens not through confrontation, but through refusal to participate in the dysfunction. Psychology has long studied the effect of cognitive dissonance in human relationships. It occurs when a person's actions don't align with their expectations or beliefs. When someone mistreats another, they often expect a reaction: tears, confrontation, pleading, or chaos. These reactions validate their perception of control. But when silence meets that disrespect, it forces an internal rupture. Suddenly, they are alone with their behavior. There is no emotional storm to blame, no reaction to control, just the echo of their own actions. A woman once shared a story of being in a relationship where every time she brought up her needs, the conversation ended in deflection. he would turn her concerns into accusations. "You're too sensitive," or "You always make everything about you." For years, she tried to communicate better, to soften her words, to ask for love in a way that wouldn't offend. But nothing worked. And then one day, she said nothing, not because she had given up, but because she had woken up. She finally understood that the relationship wasn't lacking communication. It was lacking respect. That evening, he expected the usual, a conversation, a reaction, a breakdown. But all he met was silence. She cooked dinner. She smiled calmly. She answered when spoken to. But her energy was untouchable, not distant, just deeply rooted. He asked, "Are you okay?" She looked him in the eyes and said, "I'm more than okay. I'm clear." That night, he didn't sleep. Not because she had shouted, not because she had threatened to leave, but because her silence left him with only one thing: himself. And that is a mirror many cannot face. When you stop responding to disrespect with emotional noise, you create a vacuum that demands self-examination. You are no longer a participant in the game. You are the one who changes the rules. The absence of your reaction becomes a presence in itself, one that carries more weight than any confrontation ever could. This is the heart of inner restraint. In Eastern traditions, the warrior is not defined by how often he strikes, but by how often he chooses not to. Strength lies in control, not in chaos. And the same is true emotionally. A woman who has learned to sit in her power doesn't reach for validation. She doesn't try to explain her boundaries. She lives them. This kind of silence is deeply felt. It shifts the energy in a room. People begin to second guess their assumptions. They become curious. They notice the absence of emotional dependence. And from that absence, something new emerges. Respect born not out of fear, but from recognition of inner worth. Your silence becomes your boundary. Your stillness becomes your statement. And in this way, you teach others how to treat you. Not with your words, but with your energy. We live in a world where everyone is speaking. Online, in person, in messages, constant chatter. But few are truly listening. Fewer still are present. And yet, the woman who can hold her peace in moments when others expect her to break, that woman becomes unforgettable. Her silence doesn't retreat, it holds. But silence alone is not enough. It must be supported by a deeper foundation, your energy. Because in the end, your energy speaks louder than your voice. There is something powerful about a presence that doesn't need to announce itself. We have all felt it before. A person enters the room, and without saying a word, you feel them. Their posture, their calm, their attention. It all signals something rare, a depth that can't be faked, a serenity that doesn't depend on performance. This is the silent language of energy. Modern neuroscience confirms that we are constantly picking up on the emotions and intentions of others, even without conscious awareness. Micro expressions, breathing patterns, heart rate fluctuations. These are all detected by our nervous system. What we feel about a person is not always based on what they say, but on what they radiate. And when a woman has done the inner work to regulate her emotions, to understand her needs, to align her behavior with her values, her energy becomes unmistakable. There's a phrase, "You can't fake frequency." And this is especially true in relationships. A woman may say all the right things, may play the right role, but if her inner world is chaotic, uncertain, or needy, it will show. Just as a person with peace cannot pretend to be anxious, the body knows, the energy reveals, always. A story shared by a therapist illustrates this well. She spoke of a client, a woman in her 50s, who had spent years people pleasing, laughing when she didn't find things funny, agreeing to things that made her uncomfortable, apologizing when she had done nothing wrong. Over time, her self-esteem eroded, not because others were cruel, but because her own energy had become inconsistent. She was split between who she was and who she thought she needed to be to stay loved. After working to rebuild her boundaries and practice silence in situations that previously triggered her, she began to notice a shift. Not just in others, but in herself. Her posture changed. Her tone slowed. Her presence became fuller. One day, during a family gathering, someone made a passive-aggressive remark meant to provoke her. In the past, she would have laughed awkwardly or tried to smooth it over. This time, she said nothing. She met their eyes, she held the space, and the room grew quiet. That silence, she later said, was her first real act of self-love. Her energy had changed, and people responded, not by challenging her more, but by giving her more space. Not because she demanded it, but because she had become a woman who no longer apologized for taking it. This is the transformation that occurs when silence is supported by grounded energy. You stop trying to manage how others feel about you. You stop over-explaining. You stop seeking approval through performance. And instead, you offer something far more powerful: presence. Authentic, regulated, self-sufficient presence. Eastern philosophy speaks of Wu Wei, the concept of effortless action. It is not laziness, it is mastery. It means moving with such internal alignment that your actions do not create resistance. When applied to relationships, it looks like this: a woman who doesn't chase, doesn't beg, doesn't convince. She simply is. She becomes the embodiment of her own standard. And in doing so, she attracts not just attention, but reverence. Your energy creates your reality. And the more you root yourself in calm, the more others adjust to your frequency. Some will rise to meet you. Others will fall away. But the energy you hold will always be met with a reflection. So the question becomes, what are you radiating? This doesn't mean you need to be perfect. It means you need to be consistent. Consistency in energy builds trust, both with yourself and with others. It tells the world, this is who I am, and I do not need you to approve of it for me to remain it. That level of internal sovereignty is rare, and because it is rare, it is respected. When your silence comes from peace and your energy is rooted in truth, you no longer seek power in relationships, you carry it, and it is felt. Not because you raised your voice, but because you raised your vibration. When you say less, others begin to feel more. Not because your words have lost meaning, but because your silence now carries weight. Silence, when it arises from awareness rather than avoidance, holds mystery. And mystery has a unique role in human connection. It awakens curiosity, it disrupts assumptions, and it invites others to lean in rather than turn away. Most people move through life according to patterns. In relationships, these patterns become expectations. When someone always responds, always explains, always reacts, they become predictable. And predictability, while it offers comfort, also creates invisibility. You may be present, but you are not seen. You may be heard, but you are not felt. Over time, constant expression loses its edge. It becomes background noise. But when expression is rare, when it's measured, when it emerges only after a period of reflection, its impact deepens. There's an ancient saying, the arrow that is not released still holds the tension of the bow. This is the power of restraint. The unspoken word, the pause before the reply, the space before a decision. All of these hold more influence than we realize. They give room for others to reflect, and they give your energy the chance to speak before your mouth does. Think of the last time someone close to you pulled back, not with coldness, but with calm. No arguments, no pleas, just a shift, a pause. The usual rhythm interrupted. It makes you stop, it makes you question. You wonder, what changed? Why aren't they responding the way they used to? That silence is not emptiness, it is a recalibration. It invites introspection. And for those who are emotionally connected to you, it becomes a powerful catalyst for awareness. In relationships, mystery is not manipulation. It's not about playing games. It's about preserving the sacredness of your emotional presence. When you give too much, too often, you dilute the very thing you are offering. But when you hold space for yourself, when you allow others to experience the fullness of your absence, as well as your presence, you begin to engage in something deeper. Energetic integrity. A woman once shared a simple but profound story. She had been dating someone who always expected instant replies. Messages came in with urgency, and she had developed the habit of responding within minutes, even if she was busy, overwhelmed, or emotionally drained. Over time, this man came to expect her attention on demand. If she didn't reply immediately, he would follow up with passive-aggressive texts or withdraw affection. At first, she tried to explain. She reassured him. She adjusted her life to fit his insecurity. But one evening, after a long and exhausting day, she saw his message, felt the old pressure to reply, and instead, she paused. She waited, not out of anger, not out of fear, but out of intention. She gave herself space to breathe, to process, to choose her response from a place of clarity. She replied the next morning, calmly and warmly, and something changed. He didn't lash out. He didn't disappear. He waited. Because the energy had shifted. She was no longer operating from compulsion. She had disrupted the pattern. And in doing so, she reclaimed her rhythm. This is how mystery functions. It interrupts what has been taken for granted. When you say less, when you respond less automatically, your presence becomes less available, but more meaningful. Others begin to sense that your time, your energy, your words, they are not unlimited. They are sacred. Neuroscience backs this truth. Human beings are wired to pay more attention to things that are inconsistent or unpredictable. It's called the Ayres novelty effect. The brain lights up in the face of change. When someone who normally speaks often suddenly grows quiet, the listener becomes more alert. They begin to pay closer attention. This biological mechanism is why silence, used wisely, commands presence. It forces others out of autopilot. But again, the intention behind your silence matters. If it's driven by fear, avoidance, or a desire to punish, the energy will reveal that. But if it's rooted in grounded self-awareness, if it arises from a place of, I do not need to speak to be understood, then it becomes a reflection of your personal growth. There is also a beauty to being less accessible, not as a defense, but as a way to protect what is sacred within you. When you are constantly available, emotionally or physically, people can forget that you are not a given. But when you begin to slow down your reactions, to speak only when your words are fully aligned with your truth, your value becomes undeniable. This is especially powerful in romantic relationships, where over-communication can sometimes dilute the mystery that fuels attraction. It's not about withholding affection. It's about offering it intentionally. There is a difference between vulnerability and exposure. One is sacred, the other is often impulsive. A therapist once told the story of a couple on the verge of collapse. The woman, in an attempt to save the relationship, was constantly talking, processing every emotion, analyzing every move, reaching out, seeking answers. The man, overwhelmed, began to emotionally withdraw. Their dynamic became one of pursuit and retreat, until one day she stopped. Not from despair, but from self-respect. She turned inward, she journaled, she meditated. She stopped seeking answers outside herself. When he noticed the shift, he grew curious. Her silence was not a wall, it was a window. And through that window, he saw something he hadn't noticed before: her depth, her quiet strength, her emotional independence. The very qualities that first drew him to her had returned, not through effort, But through stillness, they reconnected, not through confrontation, but through presence. Because mystery had re-entered the relationship, and with it came respect. It's important to note that this mystery isn't about making yourself less visible. It's about making yourself more intentional. It means allowing others the privilege of discovering you layer by layer, rather than handing them everything at once. It means letting your actions reveal more than your explanations ever could. In Eastern thought, there's a saying: the master does not speak often, but when she does, her words ripple like stone across water. This is not about superiority, it's about frequency. Your words are vibrations. The more aligned you are with your inner self, the more powerful your words become, even when they are few. This doesn't mean you should be silent all the time. It means you should be precise. When you say something, say it because it's true. Say it because it reflects your values. Say it because it contributes to connection, not just expression. Many people confuse speaking with intimacy. But true closeness doesn't come from how often you speak. It comes from how deeply you listen, how present you are, and how authentically you show up in your energy. And sometimes the deepest form of intimacy is felt in silence shared between two people who are fully present with each other. In relationships, it's tempting to fill every gap with words, to explain, to reassure, to demand clarity. But sometimes the most transformative moments come when we allow space, when we stop performing and simply become, when we trust that the right people will be drawn not to how much we give, but to the quality of our presence. A woman once described how, after a painful breakup, she spent 6 months in solitude, not to punish her ex, not to isolate, but to rediscover herself. She didn't post online. She didn't reach out. She didn't send long emotional texts. She simply disappeared from the chaos. When they reconnected later, he said, "You feel different. It's like I'm meeting you again for the first time." And that was exactly what had happened. She hadn't just gone silent. She had gone inward. And the mystery that emerged wasn't an act. It was a return to essence. When a woman reclaims her mystery, she reclaims her magic. She becomes someone others approach with reverence. Not because she hides, but because she no longer offers herself to be consumed. She is revealed, not explained. She is experienced, not decoded. And in that revelation, respect arises. Not from what she says, but from what she chooses not to say. From the pauses between her words. From the gaze that holds steady. From the energy that cannot be rushed. So, when you say less, don't think you are doing less. You are, in fact, doing more. You are building presence. You are inviting depth. You are allowing others to feel the fullness of who you are, not through performance, but through peace. And that is unforgettable. There is a silence that is not empty, but full. It doesn't shout, doesn't argue, doesn't chase. Yet, its presence speaks more loudly than any confrontation ever could. In a relationship, when a woman embraces this kind of silence, not from suppression, but from strength, something shifts. A man's energy feels it, his instincts register it, and respect, often elusive when words flood in emotion, emerges in the presence of calm withdrawal. This silence is not punishment. It is not manipulation. It is the quiet, dignified stance of someone who knows her worth. The reason this kind of silence instantly commands attention and respect is because it is rare. Most people speak from reaction. When they're hurt, they protest. When they feel disrespected, they try to explain themselves or demand change. But when someone steps back, not in coldness, but in conscious detachment, it activates a very different dynamic. From a psychological standpoint, the human mind is wired to notice contrast. When a woman who was once expressive becomes inwardly still, it creates a vacuum, an absence that makes the other person confront what they've taken for granted. Neuroscience refers to this as prediction error. The brain expects one thing but gets another, and in that unexpected silence, awareness is forced into the present moment. A man who once ignored words will start to notice silence more acutely than any speech. Let's consider a real-world example. A woman named Leela had been in a long-term relationship where emotional disrespect slowly crept in, not through violence or insults, but through constant dismissal of her opinions. She would speak, and he would scroll through his phone. She would express a boundary, and he would mock it as being overly sensitive. For years, Leela tried to explain, argue, express. Nothing changed. One evening, after another emotionally draining conversation, she decided not to speak. Not out of spite, but from a sense of internal knowing. She wasn't going to plead for respect anymore. She wasn't going to argue about being heard. The next day, instead of her usual texts and attempts to reconnect, there was silence. And in that silence, something changed. Her partner became agitated, confused, then reflective. He noticed her absence, not just physically, but energetically. For the first time in years, he felt the full weight of her presence. Not because she demanded it, but because she withdrew it. This is the power of emotional retreat when it comes from strength, not revenge. Eastern philosophy teaches us that water is powerful because of its yielding nature. It doesn't resist, but it flows, quietly, yet persistently shaping even the hardest rocks over time. Silence, when born from centered awareness, is like water. It doesn't resist the disrespect. It simply refuses to engage with it. And in doing so, it dissolves the ego games, the power struggles, and opens a space for something more profound to occur, self-reflection in the other. In every relationship, there comes a moment where words lose their meaning. Repetition becomes noise. You've said it all, and yet nothing changes. That moment is sacred. That is where silence must begin. And that silence does not mean emotional detachment. It means emotional sovereignty. You are no longer asking for permission to be treated with care. You are simply choosing not to entertain anything that is misaligned with your dignity. This isn't easy. In fact, it's one of the hardest spiritual disciplines, especially for those who were taught that love must always be loud, expressive, or that being silent is passive. But silence, when rooted in self-awareness, is not passive. It is presence. It is the decision to stop pouring your energy into someone who doesn't value it, and instead conserve that energy to nurture your own clarity. In psychological terms, this is a shift from anxious attachment to secure self-regulation. When someone feels disrespected in a relationship, their nervous system can go into overdrive. The need to explain, fix, or be validated becomes overwhelming. But through the practice of intentional silence, the nervous system begins to self-soothe. You learn to hold the discomfort without rushing to resolve it externally. And this act of holding, of being still within your storm, transforms you into a person who cannot be easily manipulated, provoked, or dismissed. In a study on emotional regulation, researchers found that individuals who practiced mindful silence during conflict had significantly better relational outcomes than those who reacted impulsively. Why? Because silence creates space, and in that space, both people are invited to reflect, not to attack, not to defend, but to feel, to notice what's happening beneath the surface. Imagine a woman named Aria who was constantly being tripped by her partner whenever she tried to express her needs. She would be told she was too demanding or that she was ruining the peace. One day, she stopped arguing back. She stopped explaining. Instead, she said nothing and allowed her actions to become her voice. She politely declined calls. She didn't rush to prove her love or loyalty. Her energy became quiet but firm. Within days, her partner began to question his own behavior. not because she forced him to, but because her silence reflected something undeniable. She was no longer available for emotional games. This kind of transformation doesn't require anger. It doesn't need loud exits or dramatic scenes. It happens quietly, in the subtle way a person withdraws their attention and stops feeding dysfunction. That is the power that lies within your silence. It says, I am still here, but not for disrespect. And if the other person has any emotional maturity at all, they will feel that message deeply. Even if they don't say it out loud. Of course, silence is only powerful when it is paired with inner integrity. You must be sure that your silence is not a mask for resentment, nor a passive-aggressive tactic. It must be clean, centered, honest. That's why it's essential to spend time with yourself during these moments. Reflect, write, meditate, breathe. Let the silence nourish your own clarity, not become a weapon against someone else. There's a quote from Rumi that captures this beautifully. Silence is the language of God. All else is poor translation. When you enter that space, you're not abandoning the relationship. You're anchoring into something deeper than dialogue. You're inviting your own soul to speak. And if the relationship has space for truth, it will respond. If not, your silence will guide you to a door that leads to something better. Consider one more story. A woman named Serena, who was in a relationship where every disagreement turned into her being painted as the problem. One day, during an argument, instead of defending herself, she simply went quiet. Not with anger, not with a pout, just presence. She looked at him, then gently walked away. For the next 3 days, she said nothing unnecessary. She didn't argue. She didn't try to talk it out. She simply focused on herself, her work, her peace. And what she noticed was profound. Her partner's tone softened. His defenses dropped. He apologized, not because she begged for it, but because her absence allowed him to hear his own conscience. We live in a world that values fast responses, instant reactions. But true respect, especially in relationships, is often born in stillness. It is in the silence that a person sees you clearly. Your boundaries become audible without being spoken. Your values become visible without being shouted. And most importantly, you begin to see yourself with greater clarity. You realize that being silent does not mean being invisible. It means being whole enough to let your energy speak for you. This practice requires trust, not in the other person, but in the process. Trust that by removing yourself from the noise, you are inviting depth. Trust that the silence you hold within yourself is not a void, but a signal to the universe, to your partner, and to your own heart, that you are ready for something higher, something that doesn't require you to constantly explain your worth. And when a man encounters a woman who possesses this kind of silence, it disrupts his usual patterns. He must confront himself. He must evaluate what he values. And if he truly wants to rise into a higher level of relationship, he will step forward, not out of guilt, but out of recognition. Recognition that the silence she holds is not distance, but depth. Not abandonment, but alignment. Not weakness, but wisdom. When a woman learns to sit with her silence, not in bitterness, but in balance, she begins to speak a language that needs no words. It is the language of presence. The quiet knowing that nothing valuable ever chases validation. This kind of silence does not arise from fear or suppression. It is born from wisdom. It does not seek to punish, manipulate, or retreat. It simply honors what is real and releases what is not. Respect in relationships is not begged for nor demanded. It is evoked. And the most powerful way a woman evokes that respect is not through endless explanation, emotional outbursts, or repeated compromise. It's through alignment. When her words, her energy, and her actions begin to reflect her inner stillness, something shifts. The man who may have once overlooked her presence begins to feel the gravity of her absence, not because she withdrew in anger, but because she returned to herself. This returning is the true silence. It's the kind that does not raise its voice to be heard. It simply removes itself from chaos and plants its roots in clarity. It walks away from disrespect without drama. It stays grounded when tested. It observes instead of reacts. And because of this, it commands attention without demanding it. In the end, the silence that makes a man respect a woman instantly is not one that hides her truth. It's one that stands in it. It's the stillness after disappointment that says, I will not lower my frequency to match what is beneath me. It's the pause after betrayal that whispers, I choose peace over power struggles. And it's the quiet confidence that flows when a woman knows her value cannot be argued with because it is lived, not spoken. There is no louder sound in a relationship than the silence of a woman who has found her self-respect. It's a silence that teaches, a silence that heals, and a silence that ultimately transforms not just the relationship, but the person on the other side of it. If this message touched you, subscribe to Self-Mastery and join a community grounded in growth and wisdom. Leave a comment below. Your story might inspire someone else on their journey.